and I welcome you all to Pratnex. This is the first video of the Ancient Indian History series, which is designed specifically for all the competitive exams. We will be using proven cognitive techniques such as spaced repetition, active recall, and with the help of visual aids to help you maximize the learning. Now, this video will be particularly dealing with the historical sources and its basic introduction. Now, this entire ancient Indian history series will be including about 1500 plus MCQs and previous year questions from across all the exams. Now, this will be relevant for all the exams from civil services, state PSCs, SSC, CDS, NDA, CAPF, bank, railways, and other exams. Now, this particular series and the entire history from ancient to modern will be based on NCERT, Lucent, Tamil Nadu Board, and other relevant books such as R.S. Sharma and Pearson. So this is going to be a very comprehensive video which will give you a complete clarity of everything. Now with regards to this video, first we will be comprehensively building our concepts. We'll be looking at what the different sources are, what they mean, and in a while I'll be speaking about it. But after this we'll be solving about 50 plus questions to consolidate what you have read so far. Now first we will begin with concept building. We will be learning all we need to know about the sources, and then we will move to its application, solving topic wise problems and previous year questions. And what you need to do is first listen to the entire lecture attentively and then try to solve as much as you can, although I will be covering everything again with the help of questions so that it gives you a complete revision. Now, for the sake of this video, let us quickly look at what we will be covering. So at first we'll be looking at what history is itself. Then we'll be looking at briefly why it is important, how it's done. Then we'll be looking at the sources, what they mean, what are the types. And for this particular video, we'll be covering just the Vedic literature sources. And then in the consecutive videos, we'll be covering the entire sources. And then we'll be moving on to the other sections. Now, let us move on to the most fundamental question. What is history? And why is it important? Now, when we think about history, we basically think about facts, dates, study of battles and kings. But this is not the case. It is basically a journey through time and space, which tells us how we have evolved and developed to the present day civilizations. It analyzes how society, the economy, the culture, and everything, and the other trends over a long period are reflected in the available resources. Now, we'll also see that history is not just about the past, it is about the present too. Our past is basically shaped by the present. Now, the society we live in today has been shaped by the people who have been before us. Now, this explains the cultural roots, how societies have evolved, and how it makes us learn this lesson from the past. Now, this helps us avoid repeating mistakes. This also teaches us how to ignore bad things which had created problems in the society. Case in point being the Hiroshima Nagasaki incident. Then it helps us follow things which promote peace, harmony, and progress, such as evident in the Ashoka's Dhamma, which basically promotes peace, harmony, and progress. Now, with this, we can learn lessons for governance. Now, how do we study the past? Now, before moving on to this, we'll see history is basically a systematic study of past events. Now the English word history itself is derived from the Greek word historia, which basically means to research, inquire, or investigate. Now, the Greek historian Herodotus was the first real historian of the world. Now, he wrote the book called as the Histories, which describes the background events of the Greco-Persian and the Iranian wars. Now, he was a Roman philosopher. Sorry, he was a Greek philosopher, and he was given the title of Father of History by Cicero, who was a Roman philosopher. Now, you will let me know in the comment section what is the capital of Greece, who is the current president of Greece, and I'll, I'll put a comment or a heart on the comment itself to let you know if it's the correct answer. Now, if you look at modern history, then Leopold von Ranke is considered as the father of modern history. Now, according to him, a historian is supposed to describe the past as it actually is. Now, if we look at the basic classification which we read as ancient history, modern, and medieval. Now, this tripartite division of history is given by the German historian Christoph Solarius. Now, after he created this model, this tripartite classification became the standard model for writing history and reading, which we normally read in textbooks. Now, there is also classification of bipartite division. Now, as it suggests, bi means two, so history in this case is divided into two periods, which is the prehistoric period and which is the historic period. Now, prehistoric period mostly involves the period before writing was discovered, and the period after the beginning of writing is known as historic period. Now, the time period for the prehistoric period is mostly considered as 300,000 BC and 600 BC for historic. Now, this is 600 BC till date. Now, secondly, another important thing to note here is when we talk about ancient India, it mostly involves from the beginning of time to 647 AD, which is basically from Stone Age period to Harsha's death. Now, for medieval, it basically is from 647 to 1757, which is from Harsha's death to Battle of Plassey. Now, as far as modern history is concerned, it involves a period of 1757 to all the way to 1990, now which is again from Battle of Plassey to the advent of globalization. Now, another division which we can say is the post modern period, now which is from 1991 to what we are here at present, now till date. Now, then how do we really study the past? How is history reconstructed? Now, we'll be seeing that sources are needed to reconstruct the past. Now, the sources themselves do not reveal anything about the past. They need interpretation. Now, this is what a historian's job is. He tries to evaluate different situations over long periods, and then he asks the questions as to why certain events happened and what was their impact on the society at large. Now, he also needs to ascertain facts from myths and fiction. Now, this has to be done by looking at various historical evidences available, and not only this, he is also supposed to look at the evidences and then provide a rational and meaningful explanation as to what might have happened. Now, a small example which I would like to point here is like in Harsha Charita, which is an account of King Harsha, which is written by Banabhat. Now, in this, there is no mention of defeat of King Harsha at the hands of the Chalukya ruler Pulkesin II. But we'll see that in the inscriptions of Pulkesin II, he claims victory over Harsha. So you see how there can be a difference in the sources as well. So this is what a historian is supposed to do. He's supposed to check what the evidences say, look at its context and everything, and then gauge and ascertain if it can be used to create or reconstruct the past. Now, if we look at the historical process, it begins with the collection of evidence, which is basically the sources, which we'll be looking at in this video. Now, this may include materials such as artifacts, this may include manuscripts. Now, this may also include inscriptions. Now, what these basically do is that they provide raw information about the past as to what might have happened. Now, this is the very first stage of history reconstruction, as history cannot be reconstructed, it can only be interpreted. Now, once the sources are found, now the next step is to analyze the evidence which is gathered. Now, the historians, they critically try to examine the authenticity, reliability, and the relevance of material, if it's applicable to the context they're trying to analyze. Now they cross check the different sources. Now they look for the biases present in the sources, and then they try to identify the context, when it was written, how it was written, what was the condition of that time, what was the economy, what was the religious context, what was the linguistic basis. Now, once this is done, narratives are constructed, and then they try to decipher which narratives most suits the case, and then they try to explain what happened at that time and why it happened. Now, these particular narratives are constructed using primary and secondary sources. We'll be looking at what these really mean. Now, moving on, when we talk about sources, we usually mean the sources which give us information about the events of the past time. Now, these may refer to the wrote evidence or materials used to reconstruct the past or understand the history. Now, broadly speaking, this may be classified into two. It may be classified as primary sources or secondary sources. Now, very simply, primary sources are those which are the original documents, materials or objects. It gives us direct information about the past events. Now, This basically means it includes the first-hand accounts of historians at that time, or the people who actually wrote or recorded the events that happened. Now, this may include diaries, letters, manuscripts, photographs, and eyewitness accounts. Now, obviously, as the term suggests, secondary sources are those which are based on the primary sources, which are basically nothing but the interpretation of the information available from the primary sources. Now, this may include textbook, dictionaries, encyclopedias, and dissertation. Now, the problem with this is this may include the subjective interpretation of the historians, which may to some extent include biases. So mostly primary sources are preferred over secondary sources. Now, if we look at historical sources in a broader sense, it is basically of two types. It is literary sources and archaeological sources. Now, if we compare both the sources, archaeological sources are believed to be more reliable as it is impossible to change. It is because you know there are no inherent biases or interpretations of anyone, whereas archaeological sources are the rote. Basically, they provide raw information about the event that happened at that time. Now, if we look at if we look at literary sources, it basically includes all text basically in long or short forms, written or oral. Now, these can be divided into two categories: indigenous sources and foreign sources. Now, as far as writing in India is concerned, it began as early as 2500. But if we look at the material itself as seen in the manuscripts, it is not older than 4th century BC. Now you'll see that these manuscripts present in India are written basically on palm leaves or birch barks. Now this is important. Now this is one of the reasons also we'll see why most of the evidences got destroyed, as it could not be preserved. Whereas we'll see that in Central Asia, where mostly Prakrit language were used and it spread from India itself, it is also written in sheep leather and wooden tablets. Now, as I was already saying, there are many challenges of using literary sources. Now, it is basically due to its linguistic diversity. Now, it may happen that across the length and breadth of India, a same event may be interpreted differently due to the language barrier. Now, the person interpreting the source itself may have its different interpretation. Now, there may be intersection of historical account with mythology. As you already know, many sources are based in mythology itself, and the time when it was written was also religious. Now, there may be regional biases in narratives, as evident in Harsha Charita. Now, there may be issues in preservation. Like I already said, it was written in mostly in perishable forms. Now, secondly, must be a careful consideration of the linguistic nuances and historical context. Now, it may happen when we look at the sources very threadbare in a threadbare way, we'll see there may be many things we overlook. So historians also need to look at the linguistic nuances what the text is actually trying to say. Then a care also needs to be taken of looking at what the context was, what was the background at that time, what was the economy, what was the society like, what was the context where it was written. Now, this is what really needs to be taken care of. Now, when we look at archaeological sources, it is nothing but the tangible material remains which we see. Now, we'll see that the archaeological sources or any activities related to it were mostly started by Europeans. Now, like I already said, literary sources, we have covered this already. Now, when we look at indigenous sources, now let me recap in brief what we have learned so far. It is historical sources, now historical sources, like I said, are of two types. One is literary sources, other is archaeological sources. Now, literary sources further is divided into two categories: indigenous sources and foreign accounts. Now, indigenous sources in return is divided into two categories: religious and secular text. Now, under Brahmanic text, we will see that it includes Shruti and Smriti. Now, Shruti basically means that which has been heard. Now, it is considered a canonical text. Now, it is a canonical text. Now, this is because it is believed to be a revelation. Now, it is considered that it is divinely revealed. Now, this is a unquestionable truth which is eternal and of non-human origin. Now, the Shruti basically forms the foundation upon which the teachings and tradition of the Hindu religion is based. Now, this basically describes the sacred text which forms the central canon of Hinduism itself. Now, it includes the Vedas, Brahmanas, Archaeological, and the Upanishads. Now, these form part of the Vedic literature. Now, Shruti, simply speaking, it means listening. Not to say it is listening, it means it includes the texts which were transmitted orally generation by generation. Now, it comprises of Samhita, which is, we interchangeably say it as Vedas, which is the actual text which is given by Rishi. Now, they were given to Rishi by God. Now, Brahmanas are nothing but you know explanatory textbook to the original Vedas. It explains the Vedas basically. Now, Aranyakas are basically the last portions which are based on Vedas, and Upanishads are nothing but moral teachings which are based off Vedas. Now, let us quickly take a look at what we have covered so far. Now, like I was saying, historical sources are divided into two: literary sources and archaeological sources. The literary sources are then divided into indigenous sources and religious sources, and then indigenous literary sources are divided into religious sources and secular sources. Now, religious sources themselves are divided into Brahmanic text, Buddhist text, Jain text, and other ritualistic text. Now, as far as Brahmanic texts are concerned, I already said it is classified into Shruti and Smriti. Now, Shruti basically means that which has been heard, and it includes those texts which are transmitted orally, generation by generation. Now, these are considered as sacred, eternal, and basically it is the unquestionable truth. Now, it comprises of the Samhita, which is basically the actual Veda which is given to Rishi by God. Then it includes Brahmanas, then it includes Aranyakas, then it includes Upanishads. Now, Samhita, I already told it basically means the actual Veda. Now, Brahmanas are explanatory textbooks. It explains Vedas. Aranyakas are nothing but conclusions or the last portion of Vedas. Upanishads are nothing but moralistic teachings which are based on Veda. Now, on the other hand, Smriti. Smriti means something which is remembered. Now, it is a body of text which is definite and it is written literature. Now, it is also considered to be supplementary material. Now, it includes teaching on religion, which includes what we call as Itihas, the Puranas, the Tantras, Agamas, and the Smrities. Now, we'll look at this later. Let's move on to Shruti. Now, as I already mentioned, Shruti includes the Vedic literature. So, it basically comprises of 4 literary productions which I already said, includes Samhita, the Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and Upanishads. Now, it is the actual Veda. Brahmanas are explanations. Aranyakas are the concluding or last portion based on Veda. Now, Upanishads are moral teachings. We'll be looking at each one of them very detailed, but let us move on. Now, the Vedic literature itself is divided into 2 groups, which is the early Vedic period and the later Vedic period. Now, the early Vedic period itself, we'll see it is divided into we'll see that the Samhitas first. Let us see that the Samhitas are divided into Rigveda, Yajurveda, Samaveda, and Atharvaveda. Now, These were composed basically in the Sapta Sindhu region. Now this is basically the northwestern part of the continent. Now on the other hand, in the later Vedic age, it includes all the other texts except Rigveda of the entire Vedic literature. Now this was composed in the Gangetic region. Now we'll see that in the later Vedic periods, the Aryans basically migrated from the Sapta Sindhu region to the Gangetic plains. Now the Gangetic plains mostly includes the region of Ganga, Yamuna, Doab. Now they moved here obviously because of the rich alluvial soil. Now you will see this eastward shifts due to the increased agricultural production, and this shift due to the presence of rich alluvial soil, we'll see this led to establishment of several powerful kingdoms such as Kuru and Panchala. Now talking about the Sapta Sindhu region, it includes the region of Punjab basically. Now Sapta Sindhu region basically means the confluence of 7 rivers. It is Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Bias and Satluj. Now in the ancient period, Jhelum was named as Vitasta, Chenab was called as Asikni, Ravi was called as Parushni, Vyas as Vipasha, Satluj as Shatudri, and Saraswati which is now called as the Ghagar Nakra. Now Vedas basically they are the primary source of information about the Vedic age. It gives us information about the religious, social and economical life at that time. Now when we say Vedic age, it mostly refers to the period where the Vedas were composed. Now this began with the advent of Aryans in India. Now moving on, if you look at the term Veda itself, it basically is said to be passed on from one generation to the other now through verbal transmission. Now this is why, since it is transmitted orally, this is why it is known as Shruti. It belongs to Shruti. Now if you look at the term Veda itself, it means sacred spiritual knowledge. It is derived from the word Vid, which means to know, and the term Veda as a whole then means sacred spiritual knowledge. Now this is basically a Sanskrit word. Now the Vedas are called as Aparushaya or Nitya. Now this is because it is considered to be a revelation from the God itself. It is considered to be divine. which then suggests that it is not of human origin. Now this is why it is called as Aparushaya. On the other hand, it is also called as Nitya. Now this is because it is believed to be eternal and permanent. Now this means that Vedas are basically timeless. It has no beginning, no end. It returns in all eternity. Now Vedas is nothing but it contains collection or basically compilation of hymns, prayers, rituals, and these are dedicated to various deities. Now another thing to add here would be the rishis whom these books are ascribed to are basically called as mantra drashta. Now the hymns were received to the rishis by the god themselves. Now each Veda has four parts, as I already said. It includes Samhita, Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and Upanishads. Try to recall what each one of them says. Now, if we look at the one of the first Vedas, it is Rigveda. It is one of the earliest of four Vedas. Now, it is nothing but a book of hymns and lyrics. It is one of the oldest texts in the world, which is why it is known as the first testament of mankind. Now, Rigveda contains about 1028 hymns, which are also known as suktas, and a total of 10,580 verses, which are arranged in 10 books, which we call as mandalas. Now, you'll see that most of the number of shloks are dedicated in the memory of Indra, which is the most popular god. Now, obviously, this is because of the relevance of rain and agriculture at that time, which is why it was the most important god. Now, if you look at the other gods, important gods at that time, they were Agni, Indra, Varuna, Surya, and Soma. Now, you'll see the mandala 2, second mandala, and seventh mandala are known as family books, broadly called as Kula Granth or Vamsha mandalas. Now, these contains book composed by Gritsamada, Vishwamitra, Vamdeva, Vasishta, and you'll see that the seventh and second mandalas were the very first composition, and later all the other mandalas were composed. Now you'll see that the script of 8th mandala is called Khila, whereas the first and 10th script is known as Shepak. Further, you'll see that the first and 10th mandalas were the last of all mandalas to be composed. Then another important thing here is that the third mandala is devoted to solar deity Savitri. Now, the third mandala also consists of the Gayatri mantra, which is dedicated to the sun god. Now, this was composed by Vishwamitra. Now, the ninth mandala, it is devoted to the Vedic god Soma. Lastly, the 10th mandala contains the famous Purusha Shukta hymn. Now, in Purusha Shukta, according to this, 4 persons originated from the body of Purusha or the primal creator. Now, from different parts, different persons or different classes were derived. Now, they were the mouth, arms, thighs, and feet. Now, from the mouth, Brahmana was created. From the arms, Kshatriya. Now, this is basically the Varna classification which we see. Thighs includes Vaishya, and the feet, the Shudra. Another thing would be that the 10th mandala contains 129 hymns about the origin of universe. Now this is known as Suktam. Now let us quickly revise. Like I already said, Vedas are nothing but the texts which were passed on from one generation to the other. It was done verbally, and thus it is known as Shruti, as Shruti itself means revelation. Now, the word Veda itself, it comes from the word Vid, which basically means to know, and the term Veda itself then as a whole means sacred spiritual knowledge. Now, Vedas are called as Aparushaya. It is because it is a revelation from God itself. It is divine and not of human origin. And it is called as Nitya because it is eternal and permanent, which is to say it is timeless and it has no beginning and no end. It exists basically in all eternity. Now, the rishis to whom these books were ascribed were known as Mantra Dasha. They received the hymns directly from the gods. Now, the Vedas has 4 parts: Samhitas, Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and Upanishads. Like I already said, Samhitas are the basic Vedic text which includes the hymns and prayers to praise the god. Brahmanas are basically guide for the priest. Aranyakas are basically which includes worship and meditation, and Upanishads are the moralistic teachings which includes the other mythical and philosophical teachings. Now, like I already mentioned, Vedas has 4 parts. Rigveda, Yajurveda, Samaveda, and Atharvaveda. Now, for Rigveda, you'll see it is nothing but a book of hymns or lyrics. It is the oldest text in the world, which is why it is known as the first testament of mankind. It is a collection of 1028 hymns with about 10,580 verses, arranged in 10 books, which we called as mandalas. It is dedicated to various gods like Agni, Indra, Varuna, Surya, and Soma. Out of these, Indra was considered as one of the most important gods and he was very popular at that time. Now, the maximum number of shloks in Rigveda is dedicated in the memory of Indra. Now, second and seventh mandalas are the oldest, whereas the uh, first and 10th mandalas were the last to be compiled. Now, the seventh and the second mandalas are called as the Vamsha Mandala, which is the handwritten script. Now, the eighth mandala script is known as Khila, and the first and 10th is known as Shepak. Now, the third mandala is devoted to the solar deity Savitri, whereas the ninth mandala is devoted to the god Soma. One of the most important thing here is that the third mandala consists of Gayatri Mantra, which was written by Vishwamitra. Lastly, the 10th mandala contains the famous Purusha Sukta hymn, which basically talks about the origination of four persons from the body of Purusha or the primal creator himself. Now, it includes four parts: the mouth, arms, thighs, and feet. From the mouth came Brahmana, arms the Kshatriya, thighs Vaishya, and feet Shudra. Now, the Rigvedic hymns were recited by the priest, which were known as Hotri. Now, Rigveda is also added as the UNESCO Memory of World Register. And lastly, 10th Mandala also talks about the origin of universe. Now, moving on, let's talk about one of the most important wars at that time, which is the Dasrajna Wars or the Battle of Ten Kings. Now, this is included in the 7th mandalas of Rigveda. Now, this battle broke out basically due to a dispute between Vasishtha, who was the priest of Bharatas, versus Vishwamitra, who was the priest of the alliance. Now, Vishwamitra organized a confederacy against the Sudas. Now, in this battle itself, the son of Devodas and Bharata, which is the king of Tritshu family, they won over an alliance of 10 tribes. Now, the 10 tribes included 5 Aryans and 5 non-Aryans. Now, they joined the coalition and killed their ruler Purusha Shukta, and hence emerged victorious and established the supremacy of Bharatas. Now, the most important thing here is that the battle itself was fought on the bank of river Parushni, which is the modern day river Ravi. Lastly, the Bharatas and the Puru tribe, they established the Kuru tribe. So, this battle is mentioned in the 7th mandala of Rigveda. Now, the battle broke out due to a dispute between Vasishtha and Vishwamitra. Vasishtha was the priest of Bharatas, whereas Vishwamitra was priest of the alliance. Now, in this battle, Sudas won over an alliance of 10 tribes. Sudas, I'm writing here W. Sudas won over an alliance of 10 tribes. Now, moving on to the next Veda. Now, Yajurveda deals with the performance of rituals. It is also called as the book of sacrificial prayers. Now, the term Yajur, it signifies sacrifice. Now, it basically contains details of how to perform the yajnas, which is why it is called a book of sacrificial prayers, as it deals with the performance of rituals. Now, it is divided into two parts, the Krishna Yajurveda and the Shukla Yajurveda. Now, Krishna Yajurveda is called black. It is because it is basically unarranged and unclear. It contains the mantras, the prayers, and sacrificial formulas. Whereas the Shukla Yajurveda is called as white because it is clear, arranged, and accompanied by a commentary which describes the various aspects of the sacrificial rituals. Now, secondly, the Shukla Yajurveda contains commentary in prose. The Shukla Yajurveda contains commentary in prose, whereas the Krishna Yajurveda contains mantras. Now, I hope this is clear. The Krishna Yajurveda basically contains mantras, or which we called as hymns, and Shukla Yajurveda contains prose commentary. Now, if you look at the branches of Yajurveda, it is Kashtak, Kapishthal, Maitrayani, Taittiriya, and Vajrasneyi. Out of this, Taittiriya Yajurveda is one of the most important. Now, out of this, the first four is related to Krishna Yajurveda, whereas the last one is related to Shukla Yajurveda. Now, Yajurveda is a collection of hymns composed in both prose and poetry. Now, last important thing about Yajurveda to mention is the Ishopanishad. Now, what is Ishopanishad? It is the last chapter of Yajurveda. Now, this contains discussion about the philosophical and metaphysical, whereas basically all the other Yajurvedas except this contains subject matter about law and legislation of performing the various yajanas. So, summarizing, Yajurveda is nothing but a collection of sacrificial prayers or hymns. The term itself signifies sacrifice. Now, it contains details about the performance of yajanas. It is classified into two parts, which is the Krishna Yajurveda, which is also called as black, and Shukla Yajurveda, termed as white. Now, Krishna Yajurveda contains mantra or hymns, whereas Shukla Yajurveda contains prose or commentaries about it. Now, the branches of Yajurveda are of 5 types. Out of these, the Kashtak, Kapishthal, Maitrayani, and Taittiriya are part of the Krishna Yajurveda, whereas Vajrasneyi is part of Shukla Yajurveda. Now, lastly, the Ishopanishad, which is the last chapter of Yajurveda, contains discussion about the philosophical and metaphysical. Which is very different from all the other Yajurvedas, as all the other Yajurvedas except Ishopanishad talks about laws and legislations of performing various yajanas. Moving on, Samaveda. Samaveda is a collection of melodies Now it consists of about 1549 verses. It is borrowed from Rigveda, now the verses are arranged in a way that it meets the needs of the musical notation. Now these are the melodies which were meant to be sung at the time of the Soma sacrifice. Now it basically has two parts, the Purvachika and the Uttarchika. Now this has six subdivisions which are called as Apathaka, whereas Uttarachika has nine subdivisions called as Prapathaka. So summarizing again, Samaveda is nothing but collection of melodies. It also contains chants. Now it is basically, the verses here are borrowed from Rigveda and they are arranged in a way which meets the needs of musical notation. Now these are the melodies and chants which are meant to be sung at the time of performing Soma sacrifice. Now all the verses except 75 are derived from Rigveda, like I already mentioned. Now this also forms the root of our Indian classical dance and music. Now this contains two Upanishads, and the most important thing here is the rhymes and the hymns were recited by the priest known as Udagatri, whereas for Rigveda it was Hotri. Now moving on to Atharvaveda, it is the latest Veda and it contains hymns, some of which are from Rigveda, but also contains spells and charms which reflects various aspects and popular beliefs and practices. Now it describes the popular beliefs and superstitions of the humble folk at that time. Now it is divided into 20 volumes and it contains about 1200 mantras which are directly taken from the Rigveda. Now the hymns of Atharvaveda basically tells us how to ward off evil spirit and diseases and also explains about their outcomes. Now if we look at the branches of the Veda, it is Shank and Pipalad. And for a very long time this was not even considered as a part of Veda. So summarizing, Atharvaveda is the last and the fourth of all the Vedas. It is a book of magical formulas which contains spells and charms to ward off evil spirits and diseases. It also explains about the outcomes and explanations of how to overcome the evil spirits. Shank and Pipalad are the two branches of this. Another thing here is it is also called as Brahmaveda. And this reflects the beliefs and superstitions of the people at that time. Now moving on to Brahmanas, it is another part of the Vedic literature. So it was written in the later Vedic period. Moreover, it provides the prose explanations of basically the ways how the ritual should be performed and their specific outcomes. So basically, if you look at the term Brahmana itself, it means sacrifice. So the entire term Brahmanas means the portions of Samhita which gives prose explanations and details about the sacrificial rituals and their outcome. So it is obviously composed after the Vedas to explain the hymns of it, and every Veda has several Brahmanas attached to it, and it explains the hymns in the Vedas. And it is the classification of the Sanskrit text which is embedded within the Veda. Now this incorporates both myths and legends to basically explain and instruct the Brahmins on how to perform the Vedic rituals. Now it explains the Vedic hymns. I've already told you about this. Now it is written in prose, it is ritualistic in nature. Obviously, it deals with the explanation of sacrificial rituals, and it also discusses its outcomes. Now, before we move on to this, you need to understand that each Veda has one or more of its own Brahmanas, and each of the Brahmana is generally associated with a particular Shakha or a Vedic school. Now, for instance, the Kaushitiki and Aitareya are the Brahman books of the Rigveda. So, Rigveda is associated to Aitareya and Kaushitiki Brahmanas. Now, it was it was composed by Hotri priests. Now, on the other hand, the Taittiriya is a Brahmana of the Krishna Yajurveda. Now, this is a Brahmana of Krishna Yajurveda, whereas the Shatpat Brahmana is basically associated to Shukla Yajurveda. Now, I hope you are able to recall that this is black and this is white. Now, the Brahmanas of the Yajurvedas is believed to be composed by priest Yajnavalkya. Now, this basically narrates the progress of culture from Kuru Panchal to Videha. Now, the Shatpat Brahmana is one of the oldest and the largest Brahmanas. Now, it contains commentary on Shukla Yajurveda. Like I already told you, it is associated to Shukla Yajurveda. Now, this mentions about the eastern and western seas for the very first time, and it also has references to the term mleccha. Now, this term basically means the people who were basically outside the established norms of the Vedic time. So it basically included people who were not basically, of the Vedic age, and basically who were foreigners or barbarians of that time, as they had different language and customs. So in a sense, you can say ki, it carries a connotation that the people were impure or uncultured. Now moving on, the Samaveda has three Brahmanas associated to it. It's the Jaiminiya Brahmana, the Shadvinj Brahmana, and the Panchvisha Brahmana. Now these were composed by Udgatri priests. Lastly, Gopat Brahmana is the only Brahmana which is associated to Atharvaveda. Now, another thing to note here would be that Taittiriya Brahmana is associated to Krishna Yajurveda, which I already told you. Now, it also talks about the spread of Aryans in South India. So, to briefly recap, Brahmanas basically deals with the prose explanations which gives us detail about the sacrificial rituals and their outcome. It was composed in the later Vedic age to explain the hymns of Vedas. Now it has various texts which is embedded within each Veda. Now it has both myths and legends, which was basically to instruct the Brahmins on the performance of Vedic rituals. Now each Veda has its one or more of its own type of Brahmanas, and it is associated with the Vedic school. For instance, the Kaushikiki and Aitharya Brahmanas were the books of the Rigveda. It was composed by Hotri priest. Then Shatpat Brahmana and Taittiriya Brahmana was composed by priest known as Yajnavalka. Now, out of this, Shatpat Brahmana is the one of the oldest and the largest Brahmanas. It contains commentary on Shukla Yajurveda. Now, it also mentions Eastern and Western seas for the first time. Moreover, it also narrates about the progress of culture from Kuru Panchala to Vidya period. Then, the Samaveda has three Brahmanas: Panchvisha, Shadvinch, and Chandogya. Now, these were composed by Udakati priests. Then, lastly, Gopat Brahmana is attached to Atharvaveda. Now, moving on, moving on to Aranyakas. Now, the term Aranya itself means the forest. So, Aranyakas are basically the books which interpret the sacrificial rituals in a very symbolic and philosophical way. So, these interpret the rituals in a philosophical and symbolic way. Now, in a sense, it can also be termed as forest text. Now, there are basically seven Aranyakas. So, it is Aitareya, Shankayana, Taittiriya, Maitrayani, Madhyanandin, Talwakar and Jaminia. Now, these books are opposed to the sacrifices and rituals and lay emphasis on basically meditation and moral virtues. Now, this is not of very high historical importance, and it was basically written for the hermits and students who used to live in jungles. Now, this interprets the sacrificial, like I already said, the rituals in a symbolic and philosophical way. So, moving on to a very important part of the literature, which is the Upanishads. Now, the word Upanishads literally means to be seated at the feet of a guru and to receive the teachings. Now, it contains a great variety of philosophical ideas about sacrifice, the body, the universe, and it is most closely associated with the concept of Atma and Brahman, as we know. So, if we look at the word Upanishad itself, it is combined of two Sanskrit words. Now, it is Upa and Nishad. Now, the term Upa means to sit down near someone, and Nishad means to get the secret knowledge from someone. Now, there are many important Upanishads, like for Rigveda, Aitareya and Kaushitaki, for Yajurveda, Taittiriya, Brihadaranyaka, Katha and Shvetaswatar. For Samaveda, it's Chandogya and Kena. For Atharvaveda, it's Mundaka, Prashna and Mandukya. Now, out of this, the Brihadaranyaka is the oldest of all Upanishads. Now, it is believed to be written in the 9th to 6th BCE. Now, it provides us about the first reference of the idea of rebirth. It is obviously the oldest Upanishad. Now, another important thing to mention here would be that the national statement Satyamev Jayate. Now, this has been taken from the Mundaka Upanishad. Now, this very statement Satyamev Jayate has formed the core of our philosophy, the Indian philosophy. Now, this gives us both spiritual vision and philosophical argument of sorts. Now, this particular table is very important. Now, I'll help you remember this in a very easy way. Now, pay attention carefully. Now, let's create mnemonics for this. For this, we can consider as Rak. For this, it will be YTBK. Now, for this, it will be SCK, and for this, it will be AMPM. Now, Rak, YTBK, SCK, AMPM. Now, AMPM means Atharvaveda, Mundaka Upanishad, Prashna Upanishad, and Mandukya Upanishad. Now, another thing would be there are two M's here. So, Atharvaveda would have Mundaka, and Mundaka, from Mundaka you can relate Mandukya. So, for Atharvaveda, it's AMPM, which is Atharvaveda Mundaka, Prashna, and Mandukya. And SCK, now SCK is Samaveda, Chandogya, and Kena. Now Yajurveda is YT. You can recall maybe YouTube, BK, a channel maybe. So it's for from Y it would be Yajurveda. From T it is Tatriya. From B it is Brihadaranyaka, and from K it's Katha. Now for Rigveda it's Rak. You can think it to be. I guess there's some rapper called Raka. I'm not sure. So Raka. From that it would be Rigveda, Athreya, and Kaushitaki. So moving on now. Now before moving on to Smriti, we have already covered the entire Shruti part. Let us quickly recap what we have learned so far. Now, historical sources were divided into literary sources and archaeological sources, where literary sources were further divided into indigenous sources and foreign accounts. Now, indigenous sources were further divided into religious text and secular text. The religious texts were further divided into Buddhist text, Jain text, and the Brahmanic texts. Now, the Brahmanic texts were divided into Shruti and Smriti. Now, Shruti meant something which was heard. Now, it was a revelation, which meant that it was of non-human origin, it was divine and eternal. Now, it basically describes the sacred text which comprises of our central canon of Hinduism. And Smriti means definite and written literature. Now it is not eternal, and it is constantly changing, meaning it's dynamic and of human origin. Now Shruti consists of the Vedas. It consists of Brahmanas. It consists of the Aranyakas and the Upanishads. Now let us quickly take a look at what each one of them means. First, let us take a look at the Veda itself. Now, try to recall what Veda meant. So, the word Vedas is derived from the word Vid, which meant to know. It was called a Parushaya and Nitya. A Parushaya because it was a revelation and divine, it was not of human origin, and Nitya because it was eternal, permanent, and timeless. And Vedas were passed down from generation to generation orally. Of this, Rigveda is the first text, which is basically a collection of hymns and lyrics. Further, it is the oldest of all Veda, and it is considered as the oldest text in the world also known as the First Testament of Mankind. It had 1028 hymns or suktas. It had 10 mandalas and about 10,580 verses. Now, these hymns and lyrics were dedicated to many Vedic gods like Agni, Indra, Varuna, Surya, Soma, but Indra was the most important. Now, the second and the seventh mandala were known as the Vamsha mandala. It was added at the very beginning, whereas the first and 10th was added later. Now, the third mandala is devoted to solar deity Savitri. It also contains Gayatri mantra, which is written by, try to recall, Vishwamitra. Now, moving on, the ninth mandala was related to the Vedic god Soma. The 10th mandala contained the famous Purusha Shukta hymn, and lastly the hymns were recited by Hotri priest. Also, it was in the 10th mandala where origin of universe was first talked about. Now, another thing here would be that Rigveda is also added in UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. And lastly, that the 7th mandala talked about the Dasrajna War, which was fought near Ravi River. Now, moving on to the next Veda, that would be Yajurveda, which was basically a book of sacrificial prayers. Now, it basically dealt with the performance of rituals, and it was basically a manual for performing the yajnas. It had two parts: the Krishna Yajurveda and Shukla Yajurveda. Now, this was called as black and this was called as white. This contained prose explanation in a very clear and arranged way. This contained mantras, prayers, and sacrificial formulas. Now, out of this, the Krishna Yajurveda contained Kashtak, Kapishthal, Maitrayani, and Taittiriya, whereas Shukla Yajurveda contained Vajasneyi. Now, moving on to Samaveda. Now, Samaveda was collection of melodies. Now it had verses arranged according to the musical notations. Now it was borrowed from Rigveda, and it is considered to be the root of Indian classical music and dance, the classical dance, and it contained two Upanishads, and its hymns were recited by Udgatri. Now moving on to now historical sources were divided into literary sources and archaeological sources, where literary sources were further divided into indigenous sources and foreign accounts. Now, indigenous sources were further divided into religious text and secular text. The religious texts were further divided into Buddhist text, Jain text, and the Brahmanic texts. Now, the Brahmanic texts were divided into Shruti and Smriti. Now, Shruti meant something which was heard. Now, it was a revelation, which meant that it was of non-human origin, it was divine and eternal. Now, it basically describes the sacred text, which comprises about central canon of Hinduism. And Smriti means definite and written literature. Now it is not eternal, and it is constantly changing, meaning it's dynamic and of human origin. Now Shruti consists of the Vedas. It consists of Brahmanas. It consists of the Aranyakas and the Upanishads. Now let us quickly take a look at what each one of them means. First, let us take a look at the Veda itself. Now, try to recall what Veda meant. So, the word Vedas is derived from the word Vid, which meant to know. It was called a Parushaya and Nitya. A Parushaya because it was a revelation and divine, it was not of human origin, and Nitya because it was eternal, permanent, and timeless. And Vedas were passed down from generation to generation orally. Of this, Rigveda is the first text, which is basically a collection of hymns and lyrics. Further, it is the oldest of all Veda, and it is considered as the oldest text in the world, also known as the first testament of mankind. It had 1028 hymns or suktas. It had 10 mandalas and about 10,580 verses. Now, these hymns and lyrics were dedicated to many Vedic gods like Agni, Indra, Varuna, Surya, Soma, but Indra was the most important. Now, the second and the seventh mandala were known as the Vamsha mandala. It was added at the very beginning, whereas the first and 10th was added later. Now, the third mandala is devoted to solar deity Savitri. It also contains Gayatri mantra, which is written by, try to recall, Vishwamitra. Now, moving on, the ninth mandala was related to the Vedic god Soma. The 10th mandala contained the famous Purusha Shukta hymn, and lastly the hymns were recited by Hotri priest. Also, it was in the 10th mandala where origin of universe was first talked about. Now, another thing here would be that Rigveda is also added in UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. And lastly, that the 7th mandala talked about the Dasrajna War, which was fought near Ravi River. Now, moving on to the next Veda, that would be Yajurveda, which was basically a book of sacrificial prayers. Now, it basically dealt with the performance of rituals, and it was basically a manual for performing the yajnas. It had two parts: the Krishna Yajurveda and Shukla Yajurveda. Now, this was called as black and this was called as white. This contained prose explanation in a very clear and arranged way. This contained mantras, prayers, and sacrificial formulas. Now, out of this, the Krishna Yajurveda contained Kashtak, Kapishthal, Maitrayani, and Taittiriya, whereas Shukla Yajurveda contained Vajasneyi. Now, moving on to Samaveda. Now, Samaveda was collection of melodies Now it had verses arranged according to the musical notations. Now it was borrowed from Rigveda, and it is considered to be the root of Indian classical music and dance, the classical dance. And it contained two Upanishads, and its hymns were recited by Udgatri. Now moving on to Atharvaveda was the fourth and last Veda. It was the book of magical formulas, which contained spells and charms to ward off the evil diseases. It had three Upanishads, and that was about it. Now moving on to Brahmanas, then we'll see Aranyakas, and then we'll revise Upanishads. Now Brahmanas was basically the explanation of Vedic hymns, whereas Aranyakas was called as forest books. Upanishads contained philosophical texts. They were also known as Vedanta. Now, for Brahmanas, it was in prose form, ritualistic in nature, gave a description of the sacrificial rituals. It contained myths and legends, which gave instruction to the Brahmins of how to perform the rituals. Now, it every Vedas had several Brahmanas attached to it. Now, Rigveda had Aitareya and Kaushitiki. Now, it was composed by the Hotri priest. Then for Yajurveda, it was the Shat Path Brahmana and the Tatariya Brahmana. The Shatpath Brahmana contained commentary on the Shukla Yajurveda, whereas Tatariya contained commentary on Krishna Yajurveda. Now, the Shatpath Brahmana is believed to be written by Maharishi Yajnavalkya. Now, for Samaveda, it was Panchvisha Shadvinch Chandogya, and Jaminaya. Now this was written by Udagatri priests. Now Atharvaveda contained only one Brahmana. It was the Gopat Brahmana. Now out of all these, the Shatpat Brahmana also talked about the western and eastern seas for the very first time. And let's move on to Aranyakas. Now it was forest, it is known as forest books. Now it was written for hermits and the students who used to live in the jungles. Now it was basically a concluding portions uh, of the Brahmanas. Now it interpreted the sacrificial rituals in a very symbolic and philosophical way. Now it also contained 7 parts: the Aitreya, Kaushitiki, Shanklaya, Maitrayani, Madhyandin, and Talwakar and Janimiya. Now Upanishads talked about sacrifice and the concept of Atma and Brahman. Now there were total 108 Upanishads, with 13 of them being the principal ones. Now out of this, Brihadaranyaka was the oldest of all the Upanishads. Now it also provided information reference about the idea of rebirth. Then I also told you about several mnemonics: RAK, YTBK, SCK, and AMPM. RAK was Rigveda, Aitareya, and Kaushitaki. YTBK was Yajurveda, Taittiriya, Brihadaranyaka, and Katha. SCK was Samaveda, Chandogya, and Kena. Atharvaveda was AMPM was Atharvaveda, Mundaka, Prashna, and Mandukya. Now, the national slogan of Satyamev Jayate was derived from Mundaka Upanishad. Now, I hope you know everything you need to know about the Shruti text. Now, let's move on to Smriti. The word Smriti itself literally means to be remembered. Now, this means it is a text which is dynamic in nature and not eternal like the Shruti, and it is basically a supplementary text. Now, this entire literature of Smriti contains a body of text which was composed in the post Vedic period, and it consists of Vedangas, Vedanga, the Puranas, the epics or the Itihas, and other post-Vedic classical Sanskrit literature like Upved, Tantras, Agamas, and Upangas. Now, let us see what the Vedangas is about. Now, the term Vedangas literally means the limb of Vedas. Now, if you look at the word Vedanga itself, it means the term Ved means the Vedas and Angas means limbs. So the term as a whole means the limbs of Veda. So they are basically six in numbers, and just like the limbs of the body, they perform various supportive and augmenting functions in the study and protection of Veda and their traditions. Now, it has six knowledge streams, and these knowledge streams were an integral and essential part of the education system of the Vedic age, and it aimed to promote an holistic development of the students to provide them with a better understanding of the practices of the Vedas and the Vedic culture. So, of these six subjects, it included Shiksha, Kalpa, Vyakarana, Nirukta, Chanda, and Jyotisha. Now, Shiksha basically deals with the study of sounds and their pronunciation. Now, whereas Chanda, on the other hand, dealt with the mastery of rhyme and meter. Further, Vyakarana dealt with the study of word and sentence structure. Then Nirukta meant it dealt with the meaning of complex phrases and words. Whereas Kalpa dealt with the uh, percepts associated with the performance of ritual. And lastly, Jyotisha dealt with the study of heavenly bodies. Now, this was done to find an auspicious time for the performance of rituals, as we called as Muhurat. That now, the Kalpa Sutras are basically divided into three classes: the Shrauta Sutra, Griha Sutra, and the Dharma Sutra. Now, Strauta Sutra deals with the rituals of sacrifice for the gods. Now, of this, Sulva Sutra contained information about Indian geometry. Now, Griha Sutra, as the term suggests, Griha means domestic, so it dealt with the domestic ceremonies and the sacrifices that was to be performed by the householder. Now, Dharma Sutra, like the term suggests, Dharma means the laws basically. So, sutras which dealt with the laws and the manners in which people were to be, people's conduct and customs dealt with this. Now, the foundation of Dharma Sutras can be seen in the Law of Manu text. Now, one of the most credible example of the sutra from was Panini's grammar, which is an important source to remember. Now, let us move on to the next Next part, the epics. So these began as oral traditions which were memorized, expanded, and compiled around 400 CE. Now, these reflect past genealogies of king, which means that it gives us information about the lineage of kings at that time. Although it does not mention anything about the specific dates of the events that these texts mention. Now, these are just another source of Smriti text where Mahabharata and Ramayana are the most important ones. Now, as far as the dates of composition is concerned, Ramayana was composed before Mahabharata, where Ramayana is believed to be composed during the Treta Yuga, whereas Mahabharata is believed to be composed in Dwapar Yuga. So, Ved Vyasa's Mahabharata is the longest epic of the world, which has about 1 lakh shloks. Now, these 1 lakh shloks are divided in 18 chapters. Now, out of these chapters, the Shanti Parvan is the largest. Originally, it had about 8,000 shloks under the name of Jai Samhita, and later on it was called as Chaturvinshati Shastri Samhita, or simply Bharata. Now, this contained about 24,000 verses and had stories about the descendants of the Bharata tribe. Now, later it became Mahabharata in its final version, which was also known as Sheta Shastri Samhita. It was also known as Veda. So now in this final version, it had information about the conflicts, narratives, and description, and the didactic material. Now, didactic material are those which basically give us a moral lesson. So, like I already mentioned, that Mahabharata had 18 parvas, and it had basically two recensions, which means it had two basically versions of it. Now, one of it is the northern version, other is the southern version. Now, the core story of Mahabharata revolves around two cousins. These were Kauravas and Pandavas. Now, what happened was a great war was fought between them. Now, it was fought at Kurukshetra. Now, you see that Bhagavad Gita is extracted from the Bhishma Parvan, which is one of the chapters from Mahabharata. Now, it was extracted from chapter 23 to 40 of the 6th book, which is your Bhishma Parva. Now, Mahabharata is a very encyclopedic work. Now, the story forms the core to many other descriptions, sermons, and other portions which contain teachings which were added over centuries. Now, these additions include sermons on Dharma as it was given by Bhishma while he was dying on the bed of arrows, and then the stirring discourse of Krishna to Arjuna on the eve of the war, which we know as Bhagavad Gita. Now, let's move on to Ramayana now. Ramayana is said to be composed in the 5th century BC. Originally, it had about 6,000 verses, and later it became 8,000, then 12,000, and then the final version had 24,000 verses. Now, it is known as the oldest epic of the world, also known as the Adi Kavya. It was composed by Valmiki, and Ramayana has about 7 kands. The 24,000 verses are divided into 7 kands as Balkand, Kand, Aranyakand, Kishkindakand, Lankakand, and Uttarakand. Now, Balkand, as the term suggests, describes about the birth and childhood of Ram and his brothers. And childhood of Ram and brothers. It also talks about the marriage of Ram to Sita, where he breaks Lord Shiva's divine bow called as Pinaka. Now, I need you to tell me if this term seems known to you. This is a weapon which is developed by DRDO, and it has been used in the Kargil war by the Indian Army. Now, I need you to let me know what type of weapon am I talking about in the comment section. Now, Ayodhya Kand basically covers the event leading to the exile, 14-year exile of Ram to the forest. Now, the name of the forest is Danda Karanya forest. Now, Ayodhya Kand also talks about the stepmother Keki's work, who uses a boon from King Dashrath to basically install Bharata as the crown prince of the kingdom. Now, Aranyakand basically describes the life in the forest. Life in the Dandakaranya forest. Now, it culminates by the abduction of Sita by Ravan, then followed by Kishkinda Kand, where Ram and Lakshman, with an alliance of the Sugriv and his general Hanuman, fight a war. And sorry, they don't fight a war, they basically tells the tale of their alliance, and here Ram helps Sugriv defeat and kill his brother Bali, and then to reclaim the throne. And then in the Lanka Kand, the war culminates where Ram, along with his army of monkey, and Vibhishan, who happens to be Ravan's brother, So they basically construct a bridge to Lanka, which we know as Ram Setu. So this is a key event, and then Ram eventually kills Ravana and rescues Sita. Then we have our Uttarkand, where this is an epilogue which details Ram's return to Ayodhya. Now, out of this, the Uttarkand and Balkand were added later. Now we'll next see what Dharmashastra means. Now, the word dharma is derived from the root word dhri, which means to maintain, support, or sustain. Now, this meaning is very broad and is often difficult to translate. So, this concept is based on the idea that universe is governed by a natural law, and that the moral laws guiding the lives of people should be in basically consonance with this natural law. So, here it basically refers to the ideal conduct of a person, the course of action he should have, which will lead to his fulfillment of goal. And then most importantly, another interpretation is the duty, which we also known as dharma. So this uh, concept is closely tied with the cycle of birth, death, and all, as we know. So dharma shastra, basically, these are scriptures that include moral precepts and principles for religious duty and good behavior. Now, in the past, the kings basically imposed rules as a part of the religious duty, and then they created parameters for their societal and religious code of conduct. Now, moving on to Smritis. Now, Smritis means remembrance. These are auxiliary treatises of the Vedas and are treated as a part of the revelation. Now, there are six famous Smritis. It is Manusmriti, Yajnavalkya Smriti, Narad Smriti, Parashna Smriti, Brihaspriti, and Katyayana Smriti. Now, out of these, the Manusmriti is the oldest of all. It is the oldest Smriti, and it basically deals with law. Now, this reminds me of a specific person, Smriti Mandana. Now, you need to comment below to which sport is this person related to. Now, moving on, means old. Now, sage Vedvyas is traditionally credited with the compilation of the Puranas. It was made accessible to everyone, including women and Shudras, such that they can learn about the teachings, and this is why it belongs to Smriti. Now, they were created to popularize the teachings of Veda among the masses with the help of stories, with the help of stories, myths, and parables. Now, it was originally oral narratives and it was presented as a dialogue between the narrator and sages. Now, there are 18 Mahapurans, which is also known as Mahapuran. Now, these glorify the deities or gods, and on the basis of the guns they reflect, they are classified into three groups. Now, these groups are based on the deities itself. Now, they are Sattvic, which means goodness, Rajasic, which means passion, and Tamasic, which means ignorance. Now, out of these, the Matsya Purana is the oldest. Now, for a text to be classified as a Purana, it must contain 5 characteristics. Now, the Matsya Purana explicitly lists them as Sarga, Pratisarga, Vamsha, Manvantara, and Vamshanucharita. Now, Sarga deals with the creation of universe. The Pratisarga, as the term is analogous, it suggests the dissolution and the recreation of the universe. Vamsha deals with the genealogies of deities, sages, and their kings. Now, genealogies means lineage. Now, Manvantara is basically the cosmic cycles of time. Each of these have its own Manu. Now, Vamshanucharita is basically the accounts of royal dynasties, specifically the solar dynasty and the lunar dynasty. Now, the solar dynasty was called as Surya Vamsha, and the lunar dynasty was called as Chandra Vamsha. Since solar is related to Surya and lunar is related to Chandra, and since it is Vamshanucharita, so it is very easy to remember. Now, the Purans also describe about the genealogies of various royal dynasties, including the Mauryas, the Shishunags, then the Guptas. Now, the names of various Purans include Brahma Puran, Padma Puran, Vishnu Puran, Shiv Puran, Bhagavad Puran, Narad Puran, and so on. And there are 19 Up Purans. Now, with this, we have completed the entire Smriti and Shruti, which was the aim of the video. Now, to consolidate what we have learned so far, we will review the concepts with solving the previous year questions and multiple choice questions. Now, let us begin. Now, before we move on to this, for the next video, so far we have covered Brahmanic texts, Shruti and Smriti. Now, in the next video, we'll be covering the Buddhist text, Jain text, and the entire secular text and foreign accounts. And with this, we will be completing the entire literary sources. Now, let us move on to the questions. Now, you can either pause the videos or you can solve it later and take a screenshot. Now, I will be providing the PDF of this particular lecture in the Telegram channel, and a separate PDF for solving these questions. Now let us look at the first question. So the period in which the events occurred before the existence of written records is called historical period, prehistoric period, Vedic period, none of the above. Now obviously I already mentioned you while I was teaching the context of this particular lecture that the time period before writing was invented is known as prehistory, and the period after writing was discovered is known as history. Now the period in between, which is in between prehistory and history, this is known as proto-history. Now this includes things where writing is available but we are unable to decipher anything yet. So this is where the writing is discovered. So now the correct answer for this question is prehistoric period. Obviously prehistoric period is the period where events occurred before the existence of written records. So the correct answer for this is prehistoric period. Now the next question is the 3-age system was divided into stone, bronze and iron from the collection of Copenhagen Museum were coined by Thomson, Lubbock, Taylor and Child. Now the correct answer for this question is A. Thomson. Now the full name is Christian Yerksen Thomson. Now he developed the 3-age system, which basically formed a framework for classifying prehistory into Stone Age, Bronze Age and Iron Age. Now this particular classification was based on primary materials that were used, such as the tools and artifacts at that time. So moving on to the next question. The Kalika Puran is associated with which of the following religion? Now Vaishnav, Shaktism, Buddhism and Jainism. So this question appeared in MPPSC in 2018. So the correct answer for this question is Shaktism. Now let us look at what Kalika Puran is. So this is a Puran which was strongly associated with Shaktism. Now Shaktism is basically a tradition where Shakti is worshipped. Now Shakti here means the worship of Devi or the divine mother. Now this Shakti or Devi is believed to be the absolute and primordial and source of all creation. So Kalika Puran is associated with this. Now Vaishnavism, now this basically is a religion which primarily worships Vishnu and his consecutive avatars like Ram and Krishna. Now while Purans often mention various deities, but the central theme of Kalika Puran is not Vishnu, hence this was not the correct option. And then for Buddhism, this you may know that it is a religion in the ancient India which was founded by Siddhartha Gautama, also known as the Buddha. Now, this religion does not at all focus on the deities like Kali or the concept that is found in the Kalika Puran. So this won't be the correct option either. And Jainism, of course, is also another distinct ancient Indian religion which emphasized on the principles such as non-violence and asceticism. Now, like Buddhism, this does not worship Hindu goddesses like Kali as it is described in the Kalika Puran. So, and its practices are very separate. So, this won't be the correct option either. Thus, Shaktism was a correct answer. Moving on to the next part. Which of the following is the oldest Puran? Now, this you may already know, as we have seen in the lecture, that Matsya Puran is the oldest Puran of all the 18 Mahapurans. Now, I had also told you that the Puran basically explicitly mentions 5 characteristics which must be present for a text to be classified as Puran, and this Matsya Puran explicitly lists them as Sarga, Pratisarga, Vamsha, Manvantara, and Vamshanucharita. Now, another thing to point here would be this is not only the oldest but the best preserved of the 18 Mahapurans. Now, this is basically Vaishnav Puran, which is named after the first incarnation of Vishnu. So it is related to Vaishnava Puran, and as you can see, the term itself, Matsya Puran. So this term Matsya itself means fish, which was the first incarnation of Vishnu. So thus your option A is the correct answer. This must be pretty easy for you to solve. Sarga, Pratisarga, Vamsa, Manvantara and Vamshu Charita are the indicators of A. Vedas, B. Puranas, C. Upanishads and D. Sutras. So as we have already discussed this, the correct answer for this would be Puranas. Here Matsya Purana lists basically 5 characteristics or signs for a text to be called as Purana. Now let us briefly see one by one what all of these means. Now out of this I hope you know what Veda is and what Upanishad is. So sutras are basically ancient uh, and medieval Indian text which is found in all Hinduism, Buddhism and Jainism. Now I hope you remember that Vedic literature itself can be classified as Shruti and Smriti, where Shruti was classified as Samhita, Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and Upanishads. Now, Smritis. Moving on to the next question, number 6. The number of Puranas is 16, 18, 19, and 21. So the correct answer for this is obviously number B, 18. So there are 18 main Purans called as Mahapurans. Moving on to the next question, number 7. Consider the following statements. Ramayana is considered as the oldest epic. Adi Kavya was written by Valmiki. It is divided into 7 Kands: Bal Kand, Ayodhya Kand, Aranya Kand, Kishkinda Kand, Sundar Kand, Yuddha Kand, and Uttara Kand. Option number 3, Sundara Kand is biggest among all Kands in Ramayana. Now select the correct answer using the codes given below. So if you look at it, Ramayana is obviously the oldest epic, and it is also called as the Adi Kavya, and it was written indeed by uh, Valmiki. So it is believed to be written between 500 to 300 BCE. Now it is divided into 7 Kands, which is true: Balkand, Ayodhyakand, Aranyakand, Kishkindakand, Sundarkand, Yuddhakand, and Uttarakand. Now Sundarkand is the biggest among all the Kands in Ramayana. Now this statement here is not true. Sundarkand is not the biggest among the all Kands. It is indeed the smallest. It is the smallest amongst all the Kands in Ramayana. Now out of this, Bal Kand is the longest or biggest. So the correct answer for this would be option number A. Question number 8. Originally the Mahabharata was known as Brihat Katha, Brahmins, Brihat Samhita, or Jaya Samhita. Now the correct answer for this would be Jaya Samhita. Now Mahabharata was attributed to Ved Vyasa. Now it is initially called as Jaya Samhita, which had about 8,000 verses. Then later it was expanded to 24,000 verses, where it was called as Bharata, where it had stories about its descendants. And then the final compilation had about 1 lakh verses. Now here it was called as Mahabharata or Shata Shahasri Samhita. Now moving on to the next question, number 9. In which language was the Srimad Bhagavad Gita originally written? Now this is very easy. We don't even need to look at the options. The correct answer would obviously be option number A, Sanskrit. Moving on to the next question. Which of the following is the correct order of the Vedic literature? Now this is also simple. Now look at the options: Vedic Samhitas, Brahmins, Aranyakas, Upanishads. B, Vedic Samhitas. Now you will see that in all of the options, the first one is same in all of these. Now if you look at the order at how these and what these texts mean, it is very easy to decipher. Now so if we look at the chronological order, it begins with the 4 Vedas. or the Samhitas, with it being Rigveda, Samaveda, Yajurveda, and then Atharvaveda, and then it is followed by their associated Brahmanas, and then Aranyakas, and finally the Upanishads. Now, now you'll see that Brahmanas is nothing but the explanation of hymns within the Vedas. Now, this entire represents the Veda. So, Brahmanas explains the hymns and rituals present within the Vedas. Now, Aranyakas, also known as the forest texts, now these contain the material related to the Brahmanas, and these serve as a transition to the Upanishads. Now, I hope now it is easy to remember. Now, if we briefly talk about the dates, Rig Veda is the earliest and it is believed to be composed during 1500 to 1200 BCE, whereas Samveda and Yajurveda around 1200 to 1900 BCE. Now, Atharvaveda was a later addition composed around 900 to 800 BCE. Now, after the Samhitas or Vedas, Brahmanas was followed, and dating can be around 900 BCE. Now, these Aranyakas and Upanishads are dated at around 700 to 500 BCE. So, now the correct answer for this would be number A, Vedic Samhitas first, the Samhitas first, then the Brahmanas first, and then the Aranyakas, and then the Upanishads. Now, as you see, all the other options are skewed. Now, moving on to the next question. Number 11, the legend of Satyakama Jabala, which challenges the stigma of being an unmarried mother, is mentioned in A. Jabala Upanishad, B. Prashnopanishad, C. Chandogya Upanishad, and D. Kathopanishad. So, one might think that the correct answer is A. Jabala Upanishad, since this term already has Jabala, but it is not the correct answer. So, Satyakama Jabala is a later Vedic sage. So, he appears first in the 4th chapter of Chandogya Upanishad. Now, he was a follower of sage Gautam. So, the correct answer for this would be obviously number C, Chandogya Upanishad. Moving on to the next question. From where the word Satyamev Jayate is taken? A. Manusmriti, B. Bhagavad Gita, C. Rigveda, and D. Mundaka Upanishad. So, this is a very easy answer. The answer would obviously be option number D, Mundaka Upanishad. Now, obviously, option number A, Manusmriti, is not the correct answer since it deals with the laws of Manu. Now, this was an ancient Sanskrit text and it works as a foundational work in the Hindu law and social order. And the second option, Bhagavad Gita, obviously does not contain Satyamev Jayate, as the dialogues in Bhagavad Gita is attributed to sage Vedvyasa and it is embedded within Bhishma Parva. and it contains the iconic dialogue between Krishna and Arjun at the eve of the war. So it does not contain Satyamev Jayate. Then Rigveda does not contain anything related to Satyamev Jayate, since it deals with the hymns devoted to the deities, and Rigveda is the oldest Vedic text. It has about 1228 hymns, which is divided into 10 mandalas. Now, this has been added to UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. So the correct answer is number D. Moving on to the next question. Number 13. Nachiketa legend finds mention in A. Atharvaveda, B. Shatpat Brahmin, C. Kathopanishad, and D. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So Nachiketa finds the mention in Kathopanishad. Now, Kathopanishad basically is a part of Krishna Yajurveda, and Nachiketa basically it's a conversation between the Lord of that, which we know as Yamraj or Yama, and Nachiketa, who happens to be a young 12-year-old boy who leaves his home in search of the meaning of death and beyond. So the correct answer for this would be Kathopanishad. Then let's look at the other options. Atharvaveda. Atharvaveda is the book of magical formulas, whereas the Shatpat Brahmin explains about the sacrificial ceremonies. And although it contains mythological stories and other philosophical concepts, but it does not find any mention of Nachiketa. Another thing to point here would be it also mentions about the construction of fire altars. And it has a very comprehensive commentary on the Shukla Yajurveda, which is also considered as the white, and Krishna Yajurveda is considered as black. Then Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is basically it is the oldest Upanishad. Now moving on to the next question. The famous dialogue between Nachiketa and Yama is mentioned in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Chandogya Upanishad, Kathopanishad, and Kenopanishad. So obviously, correct answer is Kathopanishad. Moving on to the next question. The Rigveda is a collection of hymns. It's a collection of stories. It's a collection of words, or it's a text of war. So obviously, Rigveda is a collection of hymns. Although it mentions about the Dasrajna War, it is not a text of war, neither a collection of words nor a collection of stories. So, with context to war, it mentions about Dasrajna War, where King Sudha fights with a confederacy of 10 kings at the Parushni River, a river Ravi, and this Dasrajna War finds mention in the 7th mandala of Rigveda. Moving on to the next question. Which one of the following Vedic literature talks about salvation? So the options are Rigveda, Lata Samhita, Brahmins, and Upanishad. So obviously, Upanishad talks about collection of philosophy within the Vedas, it discusses about the concepts like Atma, Moksha, and other things. So the correct answer here would be Upanishad, as it has discussion on salvation in the Vedic literature, and it is the primary source and the only source for discussion on salvation. Moving on. Next question. The teacher who taught Vedangana for livelihood was called A. Acharya, B. Adharvaryu, C. Updhaya, and D. Purohita. So the correct answer for this would be Upadhyaya. He was the teacher who taught Vedangana for livelihood. Moving on to the next question. The Purush Sutra related to the Varna system is originally found in A. Atharvaveda, B. Samaveda, C. Rigveda, and D. Manusmriti. So the correct answer for this would be Rigveda, as it contains the Purusha Sukta hymn, which mentions about in the 10th mandala itself. It is believed that four persons came out from the divine creator or Purusha. From the mouth came Brahmana, from the arms came the Kshatriyas, from the thighs came Vaishya, and feet the Shudras. So the correct answer is obviously option number C. It mentions about the Varna system as we know it. So the next question, match the list 1 with list 2 and choose a correct answer for the codes. Now list 1 mentions about the Vedas and list 2 the associated Brahmanas. So if we look at the options, the correct answer for this would be, let us see, Rigveda is associated with Athariya Brahmana and Kaushitiki Brahmana, and Samveda is related to the Panchvisha Brahmana, the Chandogya Brahmana, the Shadvinsh Brahmana, and the Jaminaya Brahmana. So Rigveda is related to this, Samveda is related to Panchvisha. Now Atharvaveda is related to only a single Brahmana, which is Gopatha, and Yajurveda obviously then is related to Shatpat Brahmana. Now it also includes another Brahmana called as the Taittiriya Brahmana. Now Taittiriya Brahmana is related to Krishna Yajurveda, whereas the Shatpat Brahmana is related to Shukla Yajurveda. Now last thing to add here would be that Yajurveda, the Brahmanas for this was composed by Yajnavalkya priest, whereas for Rigveda it was Hotri, and for Samveda it was Udkatri. So the correct answer for this would be A is related to number 3. A is related to number 3. So the correct answer for this would be number C. Moving on to the next question. Which of the following is the oldest Veda? So we don't even need to look at the options. Obviously, the correct answer for this would be option number B, Rigveda. Rigveda is obviously the oldest. Moving on to the next question. Trai is a name for A, the three Vedas, B, Dharma, Sangha and Buddha, C, the three gods in Hindu pantheon, and D, the three seasons. So Trai is also called as Vedatrai, and it refers to the first three Vedas being the Rigveda, the Yajurveda and Samaveda. So these are collectively known as Trai or Vedtrai. So the correct answer would obviously be the three Vedas. Trai is a name for the three Vedas. Moving on. Match the list 1 with list 2. So list 1 mentions the Vedas and list 2 mentions its designated meaning. So the correct answer for this would be C. Atharvaveda deals with medicine and also deals with chant to ward off evil spirit and diseases, and Rigveda deals with the god's grace since it deals with hymns which are directed to the deities. So Rigveda is related to option 1, and Yajurveda explains about the sacrificial rituals and the processes. So it is associated with sacrifice process, and then Samveda is obviously related to music. So the correct answer for this would be A has option number 3. So the correct answer for this would be option number A. Now moving on to the next question. Number 23. Consider the following statements. There are total 40 mandalas in Yajurveda, and the Vajsanei Samhita is related to Shukla Yajurveda. Now which one of the above statement is correct? So both the statements 1 and 2 is correct. Yajurveda contains a total of 40 mandalas, and Shukla Yajurveda is indeed related to Vajsanei Samhita. So the correct answer would be obviously number B. Sorry, number C, both 1 and 2. Moving on to the next question. Which one of the following is a Samhita of the Shukla Yajurveda? Vajasneyi, Maitrayani, Taittiriya and Kathak. Now, if we briefly look at Shukla Yajurveda, it is only related to Vajasneyi, whereas Krishna Yajurveda is related to Kashthak, Kapisthal, Maitrayani and Taittiriya. So only Vajasneyi is related to Shukla Yajurveda, so the correct answer would be option number A. All the other options are related to Krishna Yajurveda. Now Krishna Yajurveda is black and this is your white. Now Krishna Yajurveda contains mantras or hymns, and Shukla Yajurveda contains basically commentaries in prose format. Moving on to the next question. Which one of the following four Vedas contains an account of magical charms and the spell? I hope you are able to recall this. Atharvaveda is the correct option for this since it deals with the magical charms and spells which are used to ward off evil spirits and cure diseases. So Atharvaveda is the correct option. Moving on to the next question. In which Vedic text the term Varna is found, referred for the first time? A. Rigveda, B. Atharvaveda, C. Samaveda, and D. Yajurveda. So obviously the correct answer for this would be Rigveda, as the Purusha Sukta hymn, which is found in the 10th mandala, mentions about the term Varna for the first time. So Atharvaveda would obviously will not be the correct option, neither Samaveda or Yajurveda. Moving on to the next question. The ancient manuscript of India were written on which of the following materials? A. Wooden tablets, B. Copper plate, C. Sheep leather, and D. Birch barks. So in India, we used to write the texts on birch bark and palm leaves. But in Central Asia, both birch bark and palm leaves and sheep leather and wooden tablets were used to write the manuscripts. So the correct option for this question number 76 would be D. The ancient manuscripts of India were written on birch bark and palm leaves. This is one of the reasons why we were unable to preserve most of the manuscripts, which had got decayed. Moving on to the next question. The best example of the earliest historical writing is provided in the Raja Tarangini, which was written by. Now, this is one of the best and the earliest example of any historical writing. Now, the term itself, Raja Tarangini, it means stream of kings. As the term itself, as the term Raja itself suggests kings, and Tarangini means a stream. So this was written by Kalhana, and this was written in the 12th century. Now it also contains a series of biographies of various kings of Kashmir. So the correct option would be Kalhana. Moving on to the next question. The Dasrajna War was a 10 incarnation of Vishnu. B. A sacrifice to be performed by the king. C. The battle of 10 kings. And D. None of these. So Dasrajna was obviously a war which was fought in the Rigvedic time. So it is obviously not the 10 incarnation of Vishnu. It is neither a sacrifice to be performed by the king. So obviously the correct answer would be it is a battle of 10 kings which was fought at the Parushni river. It was the ancient name of the river, Ravi. So moving on to the next question. Number 30. Consider the following statements regarding Mahabharata. It was composed by the sage Vyasa and is older than Ramayana. Number 2. Originally it consisted of 24,000 verses and was called Jaya Samhita. Option number 3. The final compilation brought the verses to 1 lakh, which came to be known as the Satashastri Samhita. Now, which one of the statement is correct? So, as far as this is concerned, just the statements 1 and 3 is correct. Now, let us look at why option number 2 is incorrect. Now, it says that originally it consisted of 24,000 verses and was called Jai Samhita. But Jai Samhita contained just 8,000 verses, and the part which contained 24,000 verses was called as Bharata. and when it finally expanded to the final version of 1 lakh shlokas or verses, it was called as Mahabharata. So thus the correct answer for this question number 30 would be option number C. Just the statements 1 and 3 is correct. Moving on to the next question. Consider the following statements regarding Ramayana. It was composed by the sage Valmiki and originally consisted of 6,000 verses. Contrary to Mahabharata, it contains only narrative portion. Number 3, its composition was started in the 5th century BC, and since then it is passed through 5 stages. Now, Ramayana is indeed composed by sage Valmiki, and it consisted of 6,000 verses, and its final composition contained about 24,000 verses in the final edition. And as far as the composition is concerned, it did start in the 5th century and it passed through the 5 stages, and the 5th stage is considered to be as late as the 12th century AD. So option number 2, contrary to Mahabharata, it contains only narrative portion. Now this option is incorrect, as Ramayana also had its own didactic portions which were later added to it. So the correct answer for the question number 31 would be option number C, as option number 1 is correct and 3 is correct. Moving on to the next question. Match the following list correctly and choose the correct code. Now list 1 deals with Asian literature and list 2 the characteristics. Now this question deals with the sutras. So now Srota Sutra, Griha Sutra and Sulba Sutra, these were the components of Kalpa Sutra. Now the Srota Sutra provided basically instructions on how to perform large public sacrifices, and on the other hand, as the term Griha Sutra suggests, it was basically to guide the householders on how to perform domestic rituals and ceremonies for their daily lives. So this is related to domestic rituals. Srota Sutra is related to the royal coronation ceremonies, and Sulva Sutra, now this basically offered the knowledge about geometry and other mathematical information, particularly related to the construction of sacrificial altars which were used to perform the Vedic sacrifices. So this is related to option number 4, and obviously Upanishad deals with the philosophical interpretations. So the correct answer for the question number 32 would be option number D, which is option number A is related to number 3, this is related to B, C and D. Moving on. Question number 33, which one of the following is the oldest Upanishad? Now obviously I hope you remember, we don't even need to look at the options. Now Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is the oldest, and this is connected to the Shukla Yajurveda and this basically forms the 14th chapter of Shatpat Brahmana. Now Krishna Yajurveda, on the other hand, is associated to Taittiriya Upanishad and the Katha Upanishad. whereas Shukla Yajurveda is associated to Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Now let us move on to the next part. Also, uh, Mundaka Upanishad is related to Atharvaveda, the Aitreya and Kaushitaki is related to Rigveda, and the Chandogya Upanishad is related to Samaveda, and this is related to Krishna Yajurveda, and Rigveda is Aitareya and Kaushitaki. Moving on to the next question. The best example of the earliest historical writing is provided in the Raja Tarangini, which is written by, now we have already discussed this, it is Kalhana. It Raja Tarangini discussed about the stream of the kings, so it was written in the 12th century. Now moving on to the next question. Which one of the following is concerned with the origin of Indian medicine? Now this, I hope it's very easy for you now. The option for this would be Atharvaveda. So it is concerned with the origin of Indian medicine and consisted of mostly magical spells and charms. Moving on, the words Satyamev Jayate in the state emblem of India have been adopted from which of the following? Mundaka Upanishad, Katha Upanishad, Mundaka Upanishad, and Chandogya Upanishad. Now, Satyamev Jayate is basically a mantra from the ancient scripture. Now, we adopted this in independence as the national motto. So, this is related to Mundaka Upanishad. This has been discussed already many times. Moving on to the next question. Which one of the following is not true with regards to Rigveda? Now, let us look at the options one by one. Now, Rigveda is a text which basically deals with the collection of the Vedic hymns. Now, it is the oldest religion as you know it, religious text as you know it. So, the question of it being a non-Indo-European word included in the original text, it does not add up. So obviously this statement is not true. Let us look at the other statements. This is a reference to the Dasrajna War. This is true. It is mentioned in the 7th mandala. Now it is mentioned in the Rigveda that the Bharata chief Sudas fought against the confederacy against the 10 tribes. Now this is correct. It did happen. Now Poru sided with Bharata in the battle of 10 kings. This is also true. Moving on to the next question. Vedic literature is also known as A. Shruti, B. Smriti, C. Samhita, and D. Vedangana. Now, Vedic literature, as you know, it is known as Shruti. Now, this was transmitted orally, so the correct answer for this would be Shruti. Moving on. The river Chenab was known during the Vedic period by the name Asikni, Parushni, Shutudri, and Vidastha. Now, the river was also known as the river Chenab was also known as Chandrabhaga and also as Ashikni or Iskmati. And by the ancient Greeks, this particular river was known as Asexines. So this river Parushni is the modern name of the river Ravi. The Shutudri river is related to the modern river which you know as Satluj. The Vitasta, on the other hand, is related to the river Jhelum. So the correct answer for this would be Asikni, which is related to Chenab. Now, the easy mnemonics I would say to remember this is river Bias was known as Vipas. The river Satluj was known as Shatudri. The Indus River was known as Sindhu. Jhelum River is known as Vitasta. The Chenab River is known as Asikni, and the river Ravi is known as Parushni or Iravati. Now, last river was the Saraswati River, which we now know as the Ghagar Hakra. So the easy way to remember this would be BV or bad vibes. B suggests Beas, V for Vipas, SS for Satluj and Shatudri, SI or simple interest would be Sindhu and Indus. Now JV would be joint venture of Jhelum and Vitasta. Now AC would be Asikni and Chenab. Now PR, public relation, would be between Paroshni and river Ravi. Now next time I want you, whenever you listen to the term PR, you should be reminded of Parushni river and the river Ravi. Whenever you listen to the term or use AC, you should be reminded of Asikni and Chenab. Whenever you come across the term JV, you should be reminded of the joint venture between Jhelum and Vitasta. Whenever you solve this for general aptitude or anything, you should be reminded of Sindhu and Indus. For SS, you should be reminded of, which is screenshot, you should be reminded of screenshot of the chat, say, between Satluj and Shatudri. And BV, the bad vibes, were between Bias and river Vipas had bad vibes. So the correct answer for this was Asikni river. Moving on. Which one of the following does not come under the Shruti literature? Now the options are Brahmana, Vedanga, Aranyaka and Upanishad. So first of all, Brahmana does come under the Shruti literature. Now Brahmana is the correct answer for this. The Brahmana is correct, but we are asking which one of these are not. This is important. We often overlook these. So Vedanga is not under Shruti. Now it comes from the post-Vedic literature. Now Vedanga is basically limbs of Veda, as the term suggests. Ved and Anga. Anga means limbs. So these had about 6 auxiliary principles associated with it. Now these were Shiksha, Kalpa, Vyakaran, Nirukta, Chanda, and Jyotisha. So we already have our answer. Option number B is the correct answer for this. This is not a part of Shruti, it's a part of Smriti literature. Now moving on to the next question. The Vedic river Vitasta has been identified with. Now, just like I told you now, you need to, whenever you come across V, you should be reminded of JV, joint venture. Now, which one of these rivers had joint venture with Vitasta? It was Jhelum. Now, for river RV, it had public relation with which of the rivers? It was Parushni. Now, which was related with AC? Which river was related with AC? It was Asikni. Now, which Bias had bad vibes with which river? It was Vipas. So, BV, AC, JV, PR, and screenshot. I hope this is very clear and easy for you now to remember. Now, moving on. Which one of the following Brahmana text belongs to Atharvaveda? Now, the options are Shatpat, Atareya, Gopat, and Panchavinsh. Now, if you look at the options, Gopat Brahmana is the only Brahmana which is associated with Atharvaveda. Rest of these, this contains only a single Brahmana. Now, this basically contained uh, text in prose format describing the Vedic rituals. Now, as far as the other options are concerned, the Shatpat Brahmana is related to Yajurveda, mostly Shukla Yajurveda, and Athreya is related to Rigveda, whereas Panchavansh is related to Samaveda. Now, moving on. Who of the following led the confederacy of the 10 kings against Sudasa? Now, we have been across this question many number of times. Now, this particular war, the Dasrajna War, was fought due to conflict between Vishwamitra and Vasishta. These were the sages involved in the war. So, who of the following led the confederacy against the 10 kings against Sudasa? So, sage Vishwamitra basically led the alliance of 10 kings against Sudasa. Now, he was obviously victorious in this. So, the correct answer for this would be option number A. Moving on to the next question. Rigveda is related to which Upanishad? Now, I hope this is very easy for you now. So, Rigveda is related to Athreya Upanishad and also Kaushitaki. I hope you are able to recall. I told you about a rapper called as Raka. Forget the R, Rak. So it was Rigveda, Athreya, and Kaushitaki. So this is the correct answer, option number D. And for the other Vedas, Mundaka Upanishad, now I told you about mnemonic as Mam, which was Mundaka, Atharvaveda, and Mandukya. Now for Chandogya, I told you about SCK or Samaveda, Chandogya, and Kena. And lastly, for Yajurveda, I told you about a YouTube channel as YTBK, who was, I guess, a moto vlogger, I don't know. So this was Yajurveda, Taittiriya, Brihadarayanka, and Kathopanishad. Now moving on to the next question. Now which part of Rigveda gives an account of the origin of universe? Now the origin of universe as far as Rigveda is concerned was in the 10th book or mandala. It was in the 129th hymn. Now this dealt with the original universe. If you had paid attention to the lecture, then these questions will be very easy for you to answer. Now moving on to the next question, the battle of 10 kings was fought near. Now this should be very easy for you. It was the river Parushni, also known as Ravi river. Now this is PR. I hope now this is very easy for you. PR, JV, screenshot, and air conditioner. PR is Parushni and Ravi. SS is Satluj and Shutudri. AC is Asinki and Chenab, and JV is joint venture between Jhelum and Vitasta. Now related to JV, Shutudri, and moving on to the next question, which is concerned with the origin of Indian medicine. Now obviously the correct answer for this would be option number D, Atharvaveda. It consisted of magical spells and charms. Now moving on. Which one of the following is described in Upanishad? Dharma, yoga, philosophy, or law? So obviously Upanishad deals with philosophy, and it gives us both spiritual vision and a philosophical argument of sorts. So it is not related to law or yoga or dharma. Moving on to the next part. In Rigveda, maximum number of slokas are written in the memory of which god? Indra, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Now, if you remember the lecture, I told you that although many Rigvedic gods were present, but Indra was the most important at that time. So the correct answer for this would be option number A, Indra. Moving on. The word Gotra occurs for the first time in A, Rigveda, B, Samveda, C, Atharvaveda, and D, Yajurveda. Now, even though this has not been discussed in the lecture, you may be able to solve this. Now, this concept was first attempted to classify themselves against the groups. Now, these were done by Brahmins of that time. Now, in the present context, you'll see that marriage is not allowed in the same gotra. This is to avoid the impure matrimony, which is also in tune with the modern day, genetic paradigms of having a hybrid vigor. So this is basically to avoid genetic disorders or inbreeding in the offsprings. So this is to avoid, a shared distant, you may have a distant common ancestor and bloodline. So this reference to Gotra for the first time was mentioned in Rigveda for the first time. Now moving on to the next question. The river most mentioned in Rigveda is A. Sindhu, B. Shutudri, C. Saraswati, and G. Gandaki. So the river most mentioned is the river Sindhu, and another river which was mentioned was river Saraswati, which is now lost. Now Sindhu was the most important river and it had 7 tributaries. Was screenshot, bad vibes, public relation, AC, joint venture. Now SS was Shutudri and Satluj. Bad vibes was Bias and Vipas. PR was Parushni and river Ravi. AC was Asikni and Chenab. JV was Jhelum and Vitasta. Now moving on to the next question. So the correct answer for this would be obviously option number A, Sindhu. Now moving on to the next question. Sorry, just a moment. The Shatpat Brahmana is related to A. Rigveda, B. Samaveda, C. Yajurveda, and D. Atharvaveda. So Gopat Brahman is the only Brahmana associated to this. So Atharvaveda. So the correct answer for this would be Shatpat Brahmana is associated to Yajurveda. Now which Yajurveda? Shukla Yajurveda. Moving on to the next question. Which mandala is completely devoted to Vedic god Soma? Now the correct answer for this would be the ninth mandala is related to the Vedic god Soma, which is the king of plants. Now, it was also one of the most important gods in the Rigvedic period. Now the ninth mandala also contains a Soma mandala. It has about 114 hymns dedicated to him. Now moving on. Which mandala of Rigveda describes the battle of 10 kings? Now obviously the correct answer for this is option number C. Moving on to the next question. Which Upanishad is the smallest? Now the smallest of the 10 principal Upanishads is the Mandukya Upanishad, with the largest be Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Moving on. You need to match the rivers as per the code. Now I think this should be a cakewalk for you. Now Satluj is related to screenshot. The only term which has S here is Shutudri. So Satluj is related to this Shutudri. Now BS had a BS had a bad vibe with someone. It was Vipasha. Now Ravi had a public relation with someone. Who was it? It was River Parushni. PR. Now Chenab River was related to AC. So it was Asikni. So the correct answer for this would be number A. Now moving on to the next question. Now list 1 has Samhitas and list 2 has Upanishads. Now you need to match the Upanishads with its respective Samhitas. Now this has been done a many number of times, so the correct answer for this would be B is related to So option number B is related to 3, C is related to 1, and D is related to 4. So the correct answer for this would be number B. Rigveda is related to, I told you about several mnemonics as Rak, as SCK, the MAM, and YTBK. So Rak was associated to Rigveda, Athreya, and Kaushitaki. SCK was related to Samaveda, Chandogya, and Kena. YTBT was related to Yajurveda, Taittiriya, Brihadaranyaka, and Kathopanishad. MAM was related to Mundaka, Atharvaveda, and Mandukya. So the correct answer for this would be option number B. Now moving on to the next question. Consider the statements and select the correct answer from the codes given below. Now it asserts that Vedas are known as Shruti, and the reason is Vedas have been passed on from one generation to the other through verbal transmission. Now it is true that Vedas are said to be passed from one generation to the next through verbal transmission, and thus it is known as Shruti or revelation. Now this is true. Now Vedas has been passed on from one generation to other. This is also true. So the correct answer for question number 58 is both A and R are true, as A does explain about why Shrutis are basically called as revelation. Now Vedas have been passed from one generation to another through verbal transmission, and this is why it is also known as Shruti. So moving on to the next question, and this is the final question of this particular lecture. So you need to match the list 1 with list 2. Now this basically contains the 6 dimensions. So I hope this now should be easy for you. The Shiksha is related to the pronunciation, and Kalpa is related to the ritual, Vyakaran is related to your grammar, Nirukta is related to your etymology, your Chanda is related to the meter and tempo, and Jyotisha is related to astronomy. So the correct answer for this would be option number B. So that's it for the lecture for this particular series. This was the very first part, and for the next lecture we'll be covering the entire ancient history sources, and then we'll be moving on to other chapters one by one in the very detailed and comprehensive way. So if you find this video informative, consider sticking around and subscribe to the channel so that you get the updates, and consider liking the video if you found this lecture informative in any way, and answer the questions which I told you to do in the comment section. Thank you for watching.